Emma stood motionless, still feeling Michael's touch on her waist, even though his hand had long ago pulled away. Her heart was beating so hard that it seemed as if the walls of the room could hear this deafening thud. There was still tension in the air, not as sharp and defiant as a minute ago, but still palpable. That tension now seemed quieter, more ingrained, like an inevitability that couldn't be ignored. She felt his presence, his gaze that had been on her for so long, and she had to make an effort to finally look into his eyes. He was silent too. Everything that had happened between them over the past few weeks, every imperceptible glance, every casual gesture, all of this suddenly filled the air. But at this moment, both of them seemed afraid to say something that would destroy this fragile silence. Michael took a deep breath, disturbing her thoughts. It was a moment that brought Emma back to reality. His heavy sigh cut through the silence like a bell, reminding him that the tension that is in the air cannot last forever. We need to say something, do something to regain control of the situation. But she didn't know what exactly.
You're late. Very late.
His voice wasn't loud, but there was tension in his tone. Michael didn't scream or show any obvious anger, but his words seemed to hit her much harder than if he had screamed. His disappointment was obvious. It didn't take many words to convey this. Emma felt her chest begin to tighten with guilt and fear again.
I know,
she whispered, barely able to get the words out. Her voice was trembling, but she couldn't allow herself to show how overwhelmed she was with emotion. It wasn't just a question of being late. She knew that. He knew that. But how to start a conversation about what really tormented them both? Michael looked up at her, his gaze focused, and for the first time in a long time she was able to hold his gaze. She felt a feeling of helplessness spreading inside her. She violated his trust, his rules. She knew that deep down she should have apologized, explained herself, but the words did not come. Not the ones that would matter. Everything she could squeeze out seemed empty and unnecessary.
Where have you been? His question sounded calm, even cold, but there was a lot more emotion bubbling inside him than he showed. His face remained calm, but his eyes betrayed the tension. He wasn't ready to let his emotions run wild. Not yet.
I just lost track of time. I'm sorry,
she replied, sounding as unconvincing as she felt. She knew that this answer was insufficient. It was too simple an explanation for something much more complicated than just being late. She felt his eyes fixed on her, his gaze seemed to pierce through her, and it made her feel uneasy. Everything was shaking inside, and she realized that her reason was not the one that would justify her actions.
Have you lost track of time?
His voice was low, but there was a hidden anger in it that he was struggling to contain.
Do you understand that now? Do you realize that I'm not just sitting here worrying that you're a few minutes late? It's not about time, Emma. It's about something more.
Emma pressed her lips together, trying to hold back the words that might betray her inner feelings. She knew he was right. It wasn't just about time. They both knew that. But how could she put into words what had been bubbling inside her for the past few weeks? How can I explain that this is not just an accident or a mistake?
I know it's not just being late. I don't want to lie. But I do not know how to explain it.
Michael frowned, a mixture of surprise and disappointment flashing in his eyes. He clearly expected more from her. After everything that had happened between them in recent weeks, he was waiting for something more than just shy confessions.
You don't need to explain,
he finally said, his voice becoming more restrained.
I know there's something going on between us, but that doesn't mean you can just ignore the rules.
Emma shuddered. His words were close to what she felt, but it was scary to hear them out loud. He admitted that there was something between them, but this truth, spoken out loud, made it real. Her blood froze when he said that. She stood there, trying to realize that everything had changed now.
I didn't want it to go that far, it's just.
Her voice trailed off. She couldn't continue. How could she explain that it was, and wasn't an accident at the same time? She really didn't want to break the rules, but deep down she knew that she felt something more for him. Michael stared at her intently, studying her face, her expression. He seemed to be looking for the truth in her words, but at the same time did not want to hear what she might say next.
What was that, Emma?
Why did you do that? His voice was low but demanding. At that moment, his face lost its calmness and his eyes became hard. He couldn't hide his feelings anymore.
I do not know.
Her voice trembled. The words stuck in her throat.
I felt like I needed to do it. I needed to know where our borders were. Where are your boundaries?
At that moment, silence hung over them again. But now it was different. Not painful, but filled with the understanding that the situation will not return to its original state. To some extent, both he and she recognized that there was more going on between them than just breaking the rules. But what to do with this knowledge remained unclear.
This can't go on. Do you understand it?
His voice sounded restrained, but still penetrating. He was looking at her, his eyes expressing a mixture of sadness and disappointment, as if he didn't know how to deal with what was going on between them either.
This is not what was supposed to happen.
Emma felt her heart tighten. He was right. None of this should have happened. But how could they stop if they both knew they had passed the point of no return?
I know.
She whispered.
But I can't control it. I can't control how I feel.
Those were the most honest words she'd said all evening. She couldn't lie to herself or to him anymore. Everything that was happening was the result of those feelings that she had been trying to ignore and suppress for a long time. But they were here, and now it was inevitable. Michael looked at her. His face became serious, but there was a shadow of understanding in his eyes. Perhaps he felt the same way too. Perhaps it was hard for him to control his emotions too. But he couldn't afford to seem weak at this moment.
This is wrong, and we both know that.
He took a step back, trying to distance himself, as if hoping that physical distance would help to cope with what was raging inside. The silence that followed Emma's confession was almost palpable. She stood motionless, feeling a wave of awkwardness and guilt wash over her. Michael slowly pulled back, as if the space between them could give him some control over the situation. His face remained unreadable, and although he didn't say a word, there was enough in his gaze for Emma to understand that everything had changed now, and there was no turning back anymore. They were both on the edge, the very edge, where something more than just talking about rules and being late begins. It was a conversation about feelings, about boundaries that had long since been erased, about lines that they crossed in the depths of their souls, but never dared to admit. Emma could feel her heart pounding in her chest, and although the room was quiet, the tension felt palpable, like something physical. Michael spoke first. His voice sounded hollow, as if he was trying to control himself, not letting his feelings break out.
We need to talk about the rules.
These words were both simple and meaningful. He avoided looking directly into her eyes, his gaze wandering somewhere in space, as if he was afraid to see the answer in her face, afraid of what would happen if he met her gaze. Emma knew Michael wasn't just talking about the rules she'd broken by coming home late. It was about much more, about those unspoken boundaries that they had crossed a long time ago. But how to answer this?
Rules.
Her voice was weak and trembling. She tried to find some kind of confidence, but everything inside was shaking. It's like her whole world is about to collapse if she says something wrong.
I know I broke the rules.
She added quickly, unable to stand his silence.
I know I'm late. But it's not just about that, is it?
Michael finally looked at her. There was not anger in his eyes, not rage, but something much deeper disappointment mixed with what he could not put into words. It seemed like there was a whole storm of thoughts going on in his head, which he was desperately fighting.
No, Emma. It's not just that you came in late.
He paused for a moment, taking a deep breath.
It's about what's been going on between us for the last few weeks. About what you know but don't want to admit.
Emma couldn't help the shudder that ran through her body. These words, spoken aloud by him, seemed to completely destroy all the barriers behind which she was trying to hide. Everything that was happening was on the surface, and now it's been said. She avoided this conversation for a long time, thinking that she could avoid it, but Michael overtook her. Now there was no point in denying it or pretending that everything was fine.
I don't know what to say.
She whispered, looking down at the floor. It hurt her to admit that she hadn't been able to sort out her own feelings for so long, and now she felt completely lost.
You're right, it's not just about being late. But I can't explain what it is.
Can't you or won't you?
His voice was harsh, but not harsh. He wasn't so much angry as tired of all this uncertainty. He looked at her, and there was a mixture of emotions in his eyes: disappointment, doubt, but also something else, something deeply personal that he clearly did not want to show. Emma felt her stomach clench. He was right. She didn't want to. She was afraid that admitting everything would only make the situation worse. And even worse, it will change her life forever.
I just don't know how to explain it. How do I explain how I feel? This. Her voice trembled, and she was silent for a moment, not knowing how to continue. I do not know how to stop it. We don't have to. We shouldn't feel what we feel.
The confession was out of her mouth before she even realized it. For the first time, she said something that she had been hiding even from herself for a long time. These words seemed to tear her apart from the inside, but at the same time they brought some strange relief. Michael closed his eyes for a moment, as if those words were a blow to him too. He wanted to tell her that she wasn't alone in her feelings, that he too had been struggling with what was going on between them for a long time. But how could he admit it if it would only make the situation worse? He couldn't afford to let go of control. Not now.
Emma, I understand how you feel. But that doesn't change the fact that we crossed a line that shouldn't have been crossed. We can't go on like this. We have rules, and they exist for a reason.
He was saying this, trying to sound confident, but his own doubts were bursting out. Michael felt trapped between his duty and his feelings. He was trying to do everything right, but at the same time he realized that the situation was out of control.
What are the rules?
She suddenly blurted out, unable to hold back any longer. There was desperation mixed with defiance in her voice.
What are the rules, Michael? The ones that we have set up for ourselves so that everything is right. Do you think it works? Do you really think these rules will change anything? Because I haven't been able to keep them for a long time.
Her voice was full of pain, but also determination. She couldn't keep quiet anymore. Yes, she broke the rules, but not because she wanted to show her independence. She broke them because those feelings inside her were tearing her apart. And it was wrong. But she couldn't pretend that nothing was happening anymore. Michael took a step towards her, but stopped, as if afraid that any movement could destroy the already precarious balance. His face tightened, and something flashed in his eyes that made her heart stop.
Do you think I don't feel the same way?
Do you think it's easy for me? I'm struggling with that too, Emma. But this does not mean that we can just step over everything that is right. Emma clenched her hands into fists. Her breathing became rapid and ragged. His confession finally brought out what she had long wanted to hear. But instead of relief, it only intensified her inner conflict.
Then why didn't you say anything before?
Why have you been silent all this time? If you feel the same way I do, then why do we keep pretending that nothing is happening at all? Michael frowned, his fingers curled into fists for a moment, as if he was trying to suppress his emotions.
It's because I'm an adult. Because I have to be responsible. Do you think I haven't noticed how all this is developing? I should have stopped it earlier. I should have set clear boundaries. But I didn't do it. It's my fault.
Emma felt tears come to her eyes, but she quickly brushed them away, not wanting to show weakness.
It's not just your fault, Michael. We both didn't stop. We both crossed those boundaries. But now that all this has been said, what's next?
The question she asked hung in the air. Michael didn't say anything. He didn't have an answer to that question, because they both knew that it was no longer possible to continue as before. The silence that followed their emotional conversation hung in the air, like a thick fog. Emma stood motionless, feeling her insides churning. Michael took a few steps back, creating a safe distance between them, as if trying to regain the boundary that they had both crossed a long time ago. She was looking at him, but her thoughts were far away. A hurricane of feelings raged inside, which could not be controlled. Emma always knew that her relationship with Michael was complicated. In the early years after he married her mother, everything seemed very clear. He was her stepfather, the one who took care of her, supported her family, and gave her a sense of stability and security. At that time, Emma had not yet imagined that their relationship could go beyond these normal, understandable roles. She was comfortable in this safety, even if sometimes she felt a little tense in his presence. However, over time, everything began to change. Outwardly, everything was the same. Michael remained caring and reliable. But at the level of feelings and emotions, deep changes began to occur between them. Emma began to notice him in a different way, not as a stepfather or just her mother's husband, but as a man who aroused strange and contradictory feelings in her. Her thoughts began to focus on him more and more often, and this confused her, made her feel guilty and ashamed. Every time she caught his gaze on her, something in her froze. Every casual gesture that used to seem ordinary to her has now taken on a new hue. Every time their hands accidentally touched, an electric charge ran through her skin. At first, Emma tried to ignore these feelings, push them away from herself, write them off as stress, fatigue, or just a misunderstanding. But over time, they became more and more explicit and persistent. Emma couldn't tell exactly when things had changed. Perhaps it happened gradually, or perhaps there was some point when she realized that she could no longer perceive Michael the way she used to. Their relationship has long ceased to be simple and unambiguous. Even her own behavior had changed. She began to look for ways to be alone with him, catching his every glance, watching his mood. And although she tried to do it unnoticeably, it seemed to her that Michael saw through her. At first, she justified her behavior. She convinced herself that it was just a friendly relationship, that she should take care of him the same way he took care of her and her mother. But the further she went into these reflections, the clearer it became that all this was self-deception. These feelings were too strong to be just friendly or family. They affected her on a level she was afraid to even think about. Over time, there was a tension between them that couldn't be ignored. It was almost tangible, like a heavy weight hanging over them. Each of their interactions became imbued with this hidden feeling, unspoken, but clearly present. They both knew that something was wrong, but they continued to pretend that everything was the same. Michael didn't show that he was also experiencing something more than he should have. He always kept his distance, always stayed within the limits of his assigned role. But this role became more and more intimate for him. One day, when Emma returned home late at night, she felt the moment when this spring, stretched to the limit, began to break. She hadn't planned to be late, but the deep inner fear of meeting Michael made her delay her return as long as possible. She knew that when she entered the house, everything would change. She could feel the situation between them escalating into something more, and she couldn't ignore it anymore. Being late has become a kind of unconscious way to delay the inevitable. But she did come back, and Michael was waiting for her. His silent presence was louder than any words. Emma saw in his eyes what she had been feeling for a long time. There was no turning back now. Everything she tried to ignore or hide came to the surface with incredible force. Now it was necessary to say something. She had to admit that all their rules, all their boundaries that they had built up, were no longer working. She had to admit what she was most afraid of. Her confession was like a sharp sigh, painful and agonizing. She tried to choose words that could explain everything she felt, but no words could fully convey the full range of her emotions. Her heart was beating so hard that it seemed like it was about to burst out. There was so much pain and fear in this confession that she just wanted to run away. She couldn't suppress what was inside her anymore. These feelings were too strong, too obvious to be ignored. Emma finally admitted what she had been hiding for a long time. She feels more for Michael than she should. She couldn't pretend anymore that it was just a casual attraction or a temporary infatuation. It was deeper, stronger, and it changed her whole perception. She looked at him not as a stepfather, not as her mother's husband, but as a man for whom she feels desire, fear, and guilt at the same time. After her confession, there was a new silence in the room, but it was different. Now that everything has been said, there is no room for illusions or excuses. Michael also seemed to realize that the moment when they could return to normality had already passed. Emma couldn't understand how he felt. She tried to guess from his expression, but his emotions were too complex, too mixed for her mind to take them apart. Her confession was not so much a realization as a cry of despair. She wanted to be free from this pain, from the feeling that she was breaking all possible boundaries, from the feeling that she was ruining her life. She couldn't keep it to herself anymore. It weighed on her, tore her apart from the inside. And even now, when she said it all, she was tormented by the thought that it would not change anything for the better. She couldn't back down now. Michael was also faced with a choice, and perhaps this decision was even more difficult for him than for her. But the scariest thing for Emma was that now her confession hung between them like something irreversible. It upset the balance they had been maintaining for months. Everything has changed. After this conversation, the world for Emma stopped being the same. The confession drained all the strength out of her, leaving her exhausted, but at the same time she felt strangely relieved. It was as if the stone she had been carrying on her soul for so long had finally been thrown off. She knew that she could no longer bring back the time when everything was easier, when she could ignore her feelings and pretend that everything was okay. Now she had to live with this new awareness, with a new reality in which her confession was the starting point for something much more complicated. The very idea that she had broken a taboo, severed the thread of a normal relationship, did not leave her. She understood that everything would be different now, but she didn't know how to live with it. All that was left was to wait for the dust to settle and the world around her to take shape again. But she already knew for sure there would be no more old life. After Emma finally realized and admitted her feelings, everything inside her changed. But it brought her neither relief nor satisfaction. On the contrary, anxiety settled in her soul, as if her world had been turned upside down. Instead of feeling more free, she found herself trapped, surrounded by new, frightening doubts. Admitting her own feelings was just the beginning. Now she had to deal with their consequences. At first glance, nothing has changed. Externally, the house remained the same cozy and warm, with the same familiar smell, the silence of the evenings and the steady light of the lamps. But everything seemed strange. Her entire world, which once seemed stable, was destroyed by this realization. She couldn't look at Michael as a stepfather anymore. It was impossible after what had happened, after a confession that could no longer be taken back. But how to live on? How to hide what was going on in her soul? Doubts did not let her go for a minute. They followed her with every step, every glance, every movement. Even when she was away from home, on the street, or with friends, these thoughts did not leave her. She found herself replaying over and over in her head the moments when her feelings for Michael came to the surface. She tried to convince herself that this was a mistake, that everything could be fixed, that this was a temporary blurring. But the more she thought about it, the more clearly she realized that her feelings would not disappear. It wasn't just a mistake, it wasn't just a strange attraction, it was something much deeper. Emma felt like her every action was now overflowing with ambivalence. Even the most mundane things, breakfast with the family, walking around the house, reading books, had become filled with hidden overtones. Her thoughts were occupied with only one thing: how to live with these feelings. How could she keep pretending that nothing had changed when everything inside her was crumbling? Every time she bumped into Michael, she could feel the tension building between them. She knew he felt it. Emma felt like her every action was now overflowing with ambivalence. Even the most mundane things, breakfast with the family, walking around the house, reading books, had become filled with hidden overtones. Her thoughts were occupied with only one thing: how to live with these feelings. How could she keep pretending that nothing had changed when everything inside her was crumbling? Every time she bumped into Michael, she could feel the tension building between them. She knew he felt it too. She saw it in his gaze, she saw it in his gaze, in his movements, in the way he tried to keep his distance, not letting his feelings escape. But the tension was too intense to just ignore it. It was like a quiet but relentless hum that couldn't be drowned out. Everything they did, their every conversation, their every look, was imbued with this new awareness. Every gesture seemed unnecessarily important, every phrase too ambiguous. Their previous relationship has collapsed, and now a new reality has arisen between them, filled with doubts and fear. One of the main questions that plagued Emma was what would happen next. She knew she couldn't just forget about her feelings, couldn't bring herself to go back to the past, where everything was simpler. But what to do with this awareness? How to build a life further? The question seemed insoluble to her. If she continues to live as if nothing has happened, she will condemn herself to constant torment. But if she tries to change something, she risks destroying not only her relationship with Michael, but also the whole family. Emma often tried to imagine the future, but all her attempts seemed futile. She couldn't think of a single scenario that would lead her to a happy outcome. No matter how hard she tried, every possible outcome looked tragic and devastating. If she admits her feelings, she will destroy her family, hurt her mother and Michael himself. But if she continues to remain silent, it will be a slow self-destruction. How long can she pretend that nothing is happening? Another obstacle on her way to a solution was guilt. This guilt was eating another obstacle on her way to a solution was guilt. This guilt was eating her up from the inside, making her feel like a traitor. She was devoted to her mother. a woman who took care of her all her life, supported her, and was an example to her. Emma loved her mother, and the thought that her feelings for Michael could destroy their family terrified her. She couldn't imagine what it would be like for her mother to find out the truth, to find out that her daughter had feelings for the man she loved. That would be the cruelest wound. Emma also felt guilty about Michael. He was her stepfather, a man who from the very beginning accepted her as his own daughter, supported her when she was a teenager, helped her through difficult moments in life. And now she felt that she had betrayed him. But worst of all, she was afraid that by admitting her feelings, she would ruin his life as well. Her love for him was deep, but she understood that she carried a huge responsibility and could only bring pain. Another part of her inner conflict was fear. Emma didn't know how Michael felt about her now. After her confession, a huge gap formed between them. She couldn't understand what he was feeling, and it bothered her. He was quiet and withdrawn after that conversation, and she didn't know how to interpret his behavior. Was he afraid of the same thing as she was? Did he feel the same way, or was her confession a shock to him? She didn't know the answers, and this uncertainty scared her the most. Emma tried to avoid Michael as much as she could. She tried to leave the house while he was at work, avoided joint dinners and family gatherings. It seemed to her that if she could get away from him at least for a while, it would help her sort herself out. But even away from him, her mind was completely occupied with him. Every encounter, even an accidental one, filled her with a sense of anxiety and guilt. But at the same time she felt a strange attraction that she could not control. The feeling that her life was divided into two parts did not let go of Emma for a minute. On the one hand, there was her normal life, studies, friends, familiar daily activities. She tried to act as if everything was the same, but inside it all seemed fake. On the other hand, there was her secret life, filled with forbidden feelings, guilt and fear. And this second life was becoming more and more real for her. She felt that she could no longer hide the truth, even from herself. However, despite all her internal conflicts, Emma could not completely get rid of the feeling that her attraction to Michael was something more than just a mistake. Yes, she understood that it was wrong, that it was destroying her from the inside, but at the same time she could not deny that these feelings made her alive. When she thought about Michael, she felt not only guilt and fear, but also a strange joy, a spark that she had not felt for a long time. And that scared her even more. Emma was in a constant state of internal conflict. She knew that her feelings foe. After weeks of agonizing doubt and constant reflection, Emma felt that the tension between her and Michael had reached its climax. Every day seemed like an endless game of avoidance and pretense, where both pretended that nothing had changed, but in fact their inner world was full of anxiety and unresolved conflict. It was as if they were walking on thin ice, knowing that any careless movement could lead to disaster. But it was clear that this could not last long. Emma had long ago stopped feeling the usual calm in the house. Even those moments that used to bring her a sense of comfort and security began to seem fake. Every step she took around the house was riddled with guilt and fear, mixed with an internal struggle to control her feelings. She tried to keep the situation under control, but her thoughts inevitably returned to Michael. Each meeting with him became more and more intense, and even the silence, which had previously seemed safe, was now filled with unbearable heaviness. Michael, too, seemed to be trapped in his own thoughts. He tried to keep his distance, to avoid any conversations that might reveal his real feelings. But this only increased their mutual anxiety. There was a growing silence between them, in which there was no longer room for ambiguity or understatement. Every look, every movement was permeated with an underlying understanding of what was happening. They both knew that the moment of truth was approaching. One evening, when Emma was sitting alone in her room, she was overcome by an overwhelming feeling that she could no longer tolerate this situation. It seemed to her that her soul was literally screaming that something needed to be done to break this vicious circle. She could no longer avoid Michael and her own feelings. Every day, filled with painful silence and omissions, only increased her inattention. It was no longer just an attraction or an emotional attachment. It was a real struggle between what was right and what she really felt. Emma realized that she could no longer hide her feelings from either Michael or herself. She could no longer afford to hide behind guilt and fear of the consequences. She needed to figure out what to do next, otherwise she risked losing control not only of her emotions, but also of her life. At that moment, she decided that she had to meet with Michael and put an end to this game of silence and understatement. Even if it was painful, she knew that she would not be able to live on without it. A storm of emotions was raging inside her. Fear, excitement, desire and helplessness were intertwined into one dense mass. She didn't know what Michael would say, how he would react to her step towards the truth, but she couldn't back down anymore. She needed to hear his words, find out what he was thinking, and maybe finally break this painful bond that was tormenting them both. Emma was preparing for this to be the last conversation, perhaps the most difficult conversation of her life. At night, when everyone was already asleep, Emma came out of her room. The house was silent, and every step she took down the hall sounded deafeningly loud in that silence. Her heart was pounding in her chest, but she walked forward, determined that she could no longer delay this moment. She knew Michael was in the living room. He'd been staying up late a lot lately, probably to avoid bumping into her too. He, like her, avoided direct conversations, trying to maintain the illusion of control. When Emma came downstairs, she was overcome by a strange sense of predestination. She already knew that everything would change after this evening, that they would have to go through something new, perhaps devastating, but inevitable. She saw Michael sitting in an armchair, lost in thought. His face was tense, as if he too was expecting something. Emma took a few steps forward, and at that moment something broke out between them that could not be stopped. The silence in the room was unbearable. Both of them felt like all their tension was concentrated at this moment. Emma knew there was no point in hiding the truth anymore. It would not only be pointless, but also painful. She knew Michael felt the same way too. She saw it in his eyes, in his movements. It wasn't something that could be ignored. She stopped in front of him, waiting for him to say something, but he was silent. He was waiting, as she was, for the moment when the tension would reach its peak and tear them both apart. Time dragged by unbearably slowly. Every breath seemed too loud. Emma could feel her heart beating in time with this silent tension. She wanted to say something, but the words stuck in her throat. It was the moment when there were no words needed. Everything had already been said by the silence that had been hovering between them for the past weeks. Their eyes met, and there was so much pain and passion in that look that Emma couldn't take her eyes off his face. She could see Michael clenching his fists, trying to pull himself together, trying to suppress the feelings that were overwhelming him. But it was impossible. She knew it, and so did he. The tension has become too strong to be ignored or suppressed. She felt her whole inner world crumbling at that moment, but she didn't care. She couldn't live in this lie anymore. They both needed to get through this moment, whatever it was. Emma stepped forward, feeling the air around them literally burn. Every step brought her closer to the inevitable. She could see Michael struggling with himself, but there was something in his eyes that told her he had already given up. Their eyes met again, and she realized that this moment was inevitable from the very beginning, from the very moment when she first felt something more than just gratitude or respect for him. She came very close, and at that moment there was nothing left between them. All the hypocrisy, all the attempts to pretend that they could handle it, collapsed. Emma could feel her heart beating so hard that she felt like it was going to burst apart. She knew that this step was the last in their long game of silence. Now that the two of them were face to face, there was no room for doubt anymore. This moment was crucial not only for Emma, but also for Michael. He also understood that their relationship could no longer remain the same. His own feelings overwhelmed him, and there was no point in fighting what was going on between them anymore. He was on the verge of allowing himself to take a step forward to meet her, and they both knew that this step would change everything. Emma, trembling with tension, took one last step forward. She could see how Michael was struggling to suppress his emotions, how his hands were shaking from the effort to keep from reaching out to her. But he couldn't stop anymore. Both of them have already crossed the line beyond which there is no way back. All their past, all their feelings merged at this moment, like a wave that is about to cover them. This moment was not just the culmination of their emotional struggle. It was the realization that their lives had changed forever. Emma knew that she would never be able to return to the previous state, where she could ignore her feelings. There was nothing but the truth between them now, and that truth was painful but real. When there wasn't even a step left between them, she closed her eyes, feeling the tension between them reach its highest point. After the tension between Emma and Michael reached its climax, a new reality came in which everything changed forever. This moment was not just a turning point in their relationship, but also a signal that their lives would never return to their former course. What they felt, what they had been suppressing and trying to ignore for so long, came to the surface, and now they had to live with the consequences of that realization. Emma felt drained, but at the same time there was a strange sense of relief in her. There was no need to pretend that everything was fine anymore. She no longer needed to wear a mask in front of herself. The heaviness that had oppressed her for so long was finally lifted. But instead of calmness, a new heaviness came, the heaviness of accepting that there were no more illusions and paths to a past life. Now she was faced with the consequences of her feelings, and they left her no choice. Michael, like Emma, was also depressed. His inner world was completely destroyed, and he could no longer pretend that their relationship remained the same. He could no longer find solace in the rules he had set for himself, and the boundaries that had previously seemed inviolable. Everything he had built, everything he had lived by, was now destroyed, and he had to live with this knowledge. It was knowledge that could not be escaped, and that could not be forgotten. He, like Emma, understood that this step had changed everything. But the hardest thing for both of them was the realization that their new reality could not be as simple and understandable as their previous life. Now they found themselves in a world where their every thought, every action had huge consequences not only for themselves, but for everyone around them. Emma felt fear of the future. She didn't know how their new reality would be perceived by her mother. She didn't know if she would ever be able to live with this knowledge without feeling like a traitor. Images of her mother constantly appeared in her mind, who at that moment did not suspect anything. These thoughts tormented her, made her think about how much they risked losing. Emma spent a lot of time alone trying to figure out how to move on. Her life now seemed alien to her, as if she found herself in another world where everything was unusual and unfamiliar. Previously, she could find solace in everyday little things, in studying, in communicating with friends, but now these things seemed empty and meaningless. Her thoughts kept returning to what had happened between her and Michael. Now every step she took was colored by this event. Every decision seemed to be part of this huge and intractable conflict. Michael couldn't find a place for himself either. He thought a lot about what it meant for his life. He knew that now he had no way back, that everything he had ever built had already been destroyed. But what tormented him even more was the realization that he couldn't find a way to fix it. He couldn't erase what had happened, and he couldn't go back to his old life. This realization tormented him, did not give him peace. He was like a hunted beast, cornered by his own feelings and the choices he had made. Weeks have passed. Their relationship with Emma has become even more complicated and confusing. They could no longer interact the way they used to. Their every encounter was filled with tense silence. Every word seemed superfluous and unnecessary. They avoided each other as much as they could, but this only intensified their internal struggle. Now they knew the truth about their feelings, but they couldn't decide what to do with that truth. Emma often thought about what would happen if everything came out. She was afraid of what her mother would find out. The thought haunted her. She loved her mother, respected her, and the thought that she had betrayed her was destroying her from the inside. But at the same time, Emma couldn't bring herself to give up her feelings. Her attraction to Michael was too strong to just ignore. She was trapped between her love for her mother and her real feelings for Michael. Michael, in turn, was even more confused. He knew that if the truth were revealed, it would destroy not only his relationship with Emma, but their entire family. He was torn apart between duty and his feelings. He felt guilty about his wife, who did not suspect anything, but at the same time he could not get rid of thoughts about Emma. Everything he tried to suppress in himself surfaced with renewed vigor as soon as they were alone. His feelings for Emma became a real torture. In this new reality, they both felt trapped in a situation they had created themselves, but none of them could find a way out. Their lives turned into an endless cycle of self-blame, doubt and struggle. And every day this tension grew stronger. They couldn't pretend that everything was okay anymore, but they couldn't just stop what they were feeling. A new, even more complex dynamic was building up between them. Each of their meetings was full of tense silence. Each conversation seemed filled with hidden meanings. They could not continue to live as before. but they could not find a way to resolve this conflict. It was clear to both of them that they could no longer ignore what had happened, but each of them was afraid to take the next step. The hardest thing for Emma was that she could no longer find a foothold in her life. Everything that had seemed reliable and understandable to her before was now destroyed. She couldn't go back to her old feelings, or just give up on what had happened. It was too complicated and confusing. Her life had become a maze from which there seemed to be no way out. Michael, in turn, also felt this uncertainty. He understood that their relationship could no longer be the same, but he did not know how to cope with this new reality. He felt like he was losing control of the situation, and it was driving him to despair. He did not know how to regain at least a piece of the world that had been destroyed. Everything he tried to do only made the situation worse. A few more weeks have passed. Emma tried to focus on her studies, Michael immersed himself in work, but none of these activities brought them comfort. Their new reality has become a constant source of pain and internal struggle for both of them. Each encounter between them became another reminder that they could not return to their former lives. All they could do was try to deal with what had happened, but it turned out to be an impossible task. Eventually, Emma and Michael realized that their relationship had reached a point of no return. Now they had two options: either they would accept what had happened and try to live with it somehow, or they would destroy everything to the ground, trying to return to the past. None of these options were easy. Their new reality was painful, but it was also impossible to return to the old world. Emma felt that her life was now divided into before and after. She couldn't forget the moment when their relationship had changed, and she couldn't get rid of the feeling that everything in her life would be different now. Michael also realized that everything that had been between them before was gone forever. Now they had to accept the new reality and live with its consequences, and this was the most difficult test for both of them. And although their future was uncertain and full of pain, they knew one thing: there was no turning back anymore. Their new reality was inevitable, and they had to find a way to live with it, no matter how difficult that path turned out to be.